Hello, all you positive heads out there. It's so good to be back with all you beautiful reflections of the one source consciousness that creates and animates all things. If you're new to this podcast, of course, we are super happy to have you here, and we just ask that you bring an open mind and heart to your listening experience and to be prepared to explore vantage points that I'm convinced will help shift or solidify your current understanding of the ultimate nature of reality in a way that is extremely empowering. Speaking of exploring powerful perspectives, I'm super excited to announce the release of my very first book, The Golden Key: Modern Alchemy to Unlock Infinite Abundance. If you're ready to alchemize the circumstances in your life so that your abundance expands to an entirely new level in 2021, head over to goldenkey.gift to download the audio or ebook as my gift to you by using the code POSITIVEHEAD. All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Michael Mrazek here with me on the show. Michael is a cognitive neuroscientist at UC Santa Barbara, where he serves as the director of research at the Center for Mindfulness and Human Potential. Mike has also published more than 40 peer-reviewed scientific papers and is the author of Presence of Mind, a practical introduction to mindfulness and meditation. Hello, Michael. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is great. What a journey you have there. And I'm going to start off. I look forward to diving in and learning all about it. But before we do that, I would love to start with my cliche opener. And it is this: you're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Well, ever since I was a kid, I've been really interested in understanding what it takes to cultivate a truly reliable happiness.
Mm.
When I was little, I looked around me and I noticed that most people I knew valued happiness a lot, and yet relatively few of them actually had the level of happiness that they wanted. And for myself, especially during my early adolescence, I had a pretty good life, but I can't say I was that happy.
Mm.
And I think that set me on a path where I studied psychology in college and I studied neuroscience in graduate school. And eventually my area of interest became mindfulness, because I started to recognize that it was a really powerful tool for cultivating our happiness. So I've spent a lot of time researching the impacts of mindfulness and researching how to best teach mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, mindfulness is only one of many tools out there. And so another real passion of mine is about what's possible if you combine a whole variety of different tools and strategies and mindsets, and then you help somebody bring all of those things into their life at the same time. What does that unlock for them in terms of new levels of happiness and well-being? That's been a big focus of my research and my teaching, and just a passion of mine throughout the last decade.
Cool. Well, that was what I call the Willy Wonka answer. So in Willy Wonka, when the elevator flies into the atmosphere and out beyond Earth, or it goes up really high, which I like Willy Wonka answers. So every now and then I'll get someone who it's like literally like, this will only take me one floor, love or whatever. And you just gave us the Willy Wonka version, which is it keeps going. Maybe the elevator's really slow, right?
Yeah. Like 50 floors instead of 10.
Yeah, exactly. I accept them all. So if you would just share, you shared just a little bit there, but anything about your backstory that feels relevant to share to give people context for, who you are and how you got here.
Sure. Well, I first got introduced to mindfulness when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
At a time in my life that was pretty difficult. I I just fallen in love for the first time with this beautiful girl who fell in love with me too. And I'd made a really close group of friends. So I felt like my life had sort of come together in a way that it hadn't before. And uh, like right at that moment, my parents told me that we were moving halfway across the country to Minnesota,
Mm.
which was a really difficult transition for me.
Yeah.
We got to Minnesota, and I was kind of angry with my parents for ripping me away from this life that I loved, and I was also kind of a shy kid, so it was hard for me to branch
Starting
out
over.
and try to meet new people. Yeah, exactly. And I was totally convinced that all of these negative feelings that I had were happening to me as a
Mm.
consequence of my circumstances.
Yeah.
And fortunately, right before I left DC, one of my close friends there, he gave me a book on mindfulness. And
Mm.
when I got to Minnesota, I read a little bit of it every night before I went to sleep. And over the course of a couple of weeks, I started to really understand the message of the book, which was that in every moment of your life, you have a choice about where you focus. And that choice is actually very important, in part because it gives you a lot more influence over what you think and what you feel.
Yeah.
And I noticed that all of these difficult emotions I was experiencing were maybe in part because of my circumstances, but they were also very largely driven by the habitual thoughts that I was just running in my mind all day long. And it gave me the perspective that I needed to feel like I had a little bit more control over my mind during a time when the circumstances of my life were very much out of my control.
Hmm.
Uh, and so that was kind of like the moment of insight that set me on this path to try to really understand more about how does the mind work and how can we cultivate it in order to have a little bit more influence over how we feel in our lives.
Cool. And you've never looked back, huh? So, yeah, I think it's really interesting. And why I wanted to bring you on the show is like, we get a lot of people on the show who've sort of, I like to look at all this stuff from as many angles as possible. And the fact that you've sort of approached it from such a scientific mindset, I think is really interesting and important, right? And so, with over 40 peer-reviewed scientific papers, now are they all, beating around this kind of subject, or is there a variation in there of other things, or is this like strictly your focus is like mindfulness, meditation? Obviously director of research at the Center for Mindfulness and Human Potential. I just guessed that it would all be pertaining to that, but I'm just curious if there was other topics in there.
Yeah, most of it is about that topic. I guess one sort of lucky uh, moment in my life is that when I started graduate school at UC Santa Barbara, a year later, my primary academic mentor, Jonathan Schooler, came to UCSB as well. And he is sort of a world expert on mind wandering and the tendency for the mind to sort of drift off to
Mm,
thoughts that are unrelated to what you're doing in the here and now.
true. I
And at
definitely
that
know
time
about
in my
that
life,
sometimes.
yeah, at that time in my life, I was developing a real deep personal interest in mindfulness. And Jonathan and I really hit it off, and we realized that there was a lot of synergy between our interests because mindfulness and mind wandering in some ways are kind of like two sides of the same coin.
Right,
And
right.
so I did a lot of work with him. We still work together closely, and so a lot of my work has been about mind wandering and understanding when people get distracted, sort of the ways in which they get distracted, and how that interferes with their performance on the types of things that you might actually want to be able to really focus on. And
Yeah.
so a bunch of those papers that you mentioned are, yeah, they're actually about mind wandering and the disruptive influence of distraction.
Mm,
But we realized pretty quickly that mindfulness is a pretty effective antidote for mind wandering and distraction. And
mm,
so a lot of our work started focusing on how can we use mindfulness to reduce mind wandering, at least during the times where you really want to be able to focus,
yeah.
and then use that as a tool to be able to improve your reading comprehension or your working memory or other aspects of your performance.
Cool. It's kind of ironic because as soon as you bring that up, I think of being on Zoom calls I do really well on interviews. I think like this, we're on Zoom at the moment as we're talking. But other business kind of, Zooms that I'm on at times, and I observe myself, like, wow, you are really wandering elsewhere other than being present and focused on what is happening. So Zoom is a place where I find myself, mind wandering the most. So I definitely can relate to that and really seeing it in myself.
Yeah, you're definitely not alone. I mean, some of the research on this suggests that people mind wander between a third to a half of their waking lives. So
Wow.
this is a very big part of people's experience of life. And when you're on a Zoom meeting and there's a lot of people there and it's
Yep.
maybe not the most riveting thing, that's kind of a prime opportunity for mind wandering because it
Yep.
does serve a purpose. It's not like it's just inherently a bad thing. I mean, we have busy lives, we have lots of interests. And so if there's a window of opportunity where you could actually extract more value by
Yep.
thinking about something else that you're excited about,
Yep.
maybe it makes sense to do that.
Yeah, right. There's a time and place where it makes sense, and then like so many things in life, moderation and the right context and time and place. So, wow,
Yeah.
a third to half, and I'm assuming it's like anything where if you're focused on working out, you're going to get better muscles. If you're focused on being more present, you're going to, be more present. And we all know those people who are, especially in like the transformational kind of community. It's kind of a joke of the guy that, has the overly long stare as he's greeting you, and like, just staring deeply, gazing into your eyes. And it's like, and then that can almost seem like taking it too far sometimes, like being too present where it seems, contrived, I guess. So, I
Yeah.
suppose it all comes down to finding the real healthy balance with all this stuff, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I like to think about it as giving people more choice or influence over where their attention is focused. And that a lot of people don't feel like they have that choice. They
Hmm.
sit down to try to write an email, but a minute later they find themselves on like a different browser tab or checking their phone or thinking about something unrelated.
Yep.
And that's frustrating, right? That's hard if you can't focus when you want to. And so, yeah, training in mindfulness doesn't mean that you become a robot and 24/7 you have to be completely focused on what's happening in the present moment, but it means that when you want to, you can get dialed in on what's happening in the here and now.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course that focus is so powerful when you do. And I can notice in myself sometimes, you talked about different tabs or browsers or, when you have a lot that you are aiming to do or a lot on your plate, I can find myself sometimes, I'll catch myself like, oh, you're almost getting in like a frantic state of changing between the things. Like, oh, I want to do this. Oh, hold on. What about this? Oh, what if I do this? And then it's like, hold on, you're now not in a very, you're not being mindful at all. And you're actually introducing like frenetic energy, and
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it happens to all of us, but there's two kind of consequences of that science has really documented that I think we should be aware of. And one is about the effectiveness of multitasking in that way and switching back and forth
mm-hmm.
between things. And there's something called the cost of task switching.
Mm,
And when you go back and forth between two different tasks, you might feel like you seamlessly, instantly switch into that other mode. But actually, research shows that it takes your brain a little while to make that switch.
yeah.
And so if you're jumping around minute by minute on different projects, your brain never gets the opportunity to really settle into one task where it can do its best work. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the problems with the multitasking that we all do is that it prevents us from getting into that deep work. But
Yeah.
the other thing that you're alluding to is that it can create this stress in our lives that if we're constantly going back and forth and we have a million tabs open, not only in our computers, but in our minds,
Yeah.
then we're holding all of the responsibility and worry and stress of our life all at once and not really effectively resolving any of it. And that's just a very stressful place to live.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I think one of the reasons why in this day and age it's so important to carve out a little bit of time to practice mindfulness and to learn how to really do one thing at a time.
Yeah. I really have found as someone who is very predisposition to doing, go, 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 frantic kind of, I'm a high energy person. And I have really found that, like, it's taken me probably a slow learner with it to some degree too. Like, I can see when I'm like in that state and I've introduced stress and it's sort of like self-imposed. And it's like, okay, the best, most productive thing I can do is slow down and take a walk or, any of these sorts of like things that go in the opposite direction. And and if you're really paying attention to like I definitely think I'm someone who focuses and catches synchronicity and pattern recognition and things like that, probably more than the average person, I would imagine. And it's like, so if I start paying attention, it's like sometimes the best things that come are like, oh, I wasn't even focused on what it is that instead of doing something to achieve something, I'm actually, I am participating in self-care. And then all of a sudden you get the phone call out of nowhere that's more valuable than 10 hours of frantic work. Right. And so
Yeah.
I've noticed like, oh, okay, it's really, and it comes back to something that, I say all the time. And of course we teach best what we most need to learn. And it is, our number one job is managing our vibration and in keeping ourselves in that state of, talking to you instantly. I mean, everyone can hear it. You're like, you've got that very peaceful Zen energy, and that's a powerful thing. A lot can come from that.
Yeah, I sometimes think about it in terms of our vitality is a word that I like to use, and that when we're in a place of feeling stressed and tired and distracted, that it's really hard to do your best work. Just like you said, sometimes you might work for a week, but you won't create the same outcome that if you're actually in a calm, rested, mindful place, the work might come much faster.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. It also makes me think. I think you'd really enjoy talking to my mentor, Jonathan Scholar, because he's done a lot of research on mind wandering and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he's learned is that sometimes our best, most creative ideas actually come when we're not working. He's published some really interesting work that suggests that when you're just you're washing dishes at night, or you're taking a little time off, suddenly inspiration strikes, and like
Yep.
the idea that's really going to move things forward arrives at that moment. And I think that's not intuitive for everybody. Most people think you have to keep grinding, you have to keep working
Yep.
hard, but sometimes you give yourself a break, and that's your mind kind of keeps working in the background
Yeah.
and starts spitting out the creative ideas that might actually really make a difference.
Yeah, yeah, it's that whole idea of like, best ideas come, in the shower or shaving or,
Mhm.
for me, I found even sometimes in that sort of in the morning kind of in between awake and asleep, that kind of in between state, sometimes it'll be like a flurry of, ahas, and of course, I'm not actively working, which actually leads me to thinking of a few different friends I know who talk about having. I'm curious what you think about this idea of. I'm sure you've come across people or even had the experience yourself where they're actually working while they sleep. So sometimes they wake up and they're like, "Oh gosh, I feel like I just got off an 8-hour shift. My brain is literally just here trying to like." Solve problems and deal with my job, my work, whatever. And I feel like I didn't get, I know I have an ex-business partner who that would happen to a lot. And my partner now, it happens with her sometimes as well. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that feeling of kind of bringing your work and your responsibility with you, into a night's sleep. Um, I think it's, for years when I've fallen asleep at night, what I've done is falling asleep focusing on my breath.
Mm,
And part of the reason why I do that is I use it as kind of an interrupt to the thinking mind that's like involved with all of my responsibilities, because I don't want that to bleed into the times in my life when I'm really just supposed to rest.
mm,
And it kind of sets that intention for me. Then, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I found that I was dreaming about it, or I'm waking up and thinking about work, I just sort of come back to that breath, to kind of let go of those responsibilities. You've maybe heard of this metaphor, but if you try to hold a glass of water with your arm extended at shoulder height, and you hold it there for a couple of minutes, it's exhausting. After a couple of minutes of holding just a glass of water, your muscles are trembling. But if you can set the glass down periodically and then pick it back up, it's very easy to hold a glass of water for 2 minutes. And
yeah.
I think there's
Mm,
mindfulness offers a path to being able to set down some of our worries and our responsibilities so that we can rest in order to pick them up again. But I
mm.
do also just want to share one sort of random thought that I don't know if you know Ray Kurzweil, but he's
Hmm.
a futurist, a really fascinating guy, kind of a genius. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, I heard not long ago that he actually uses sleep as a period of incubation, like to arrive at creative ideas. And so before he goes to sleep at night, he actually sets the intention about what problem he wants to
Mm.
solve, and often finds that then when he wakes up in the morning, he has like arrived at the answer. And so
Wow.
maybe there are really skillful ways of using sleep to kind of move things forward, but I think for most people it's on the other side of the continuum where they can't set down all of their burdens, and they need a way to just be able to relax and rest.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's once again back to there is a time and a place where, in a way, in a method that it could possibly be very positive, and I've certainly had that experience as well, and but I love your idea of using your breath as like, oh, this is just a simple technique and of course you've trained yourself up. This is what this means. This means shut all that off and going to a restful, mindful kind of state. And um, I'm gonna definitely give that a try next time I wake up. It's funny because I sleep really well. Maybe once a month I'll wake up for some reason and my brain starts going and then I have trouble going back to sleep. And that happened to me last night.
Mm.
So, next time I'm going to focus on my breath, see where it gets me.
Yeah, it happens to me. It happens to me fairly often. I've often had this theory that uh, when we're just starting to wake up, whether it's the first thing in the morning or in the middle of the night, some of our defense mechanisms are down, like they're not fully active. And so some of the things in your life that are maybe bothering you, but that in your daily life you're not fully aware of, you're not really dealing with, have an opportunity to kind of grab your attention in the middle of the night, which I don't know if there's like science to back that up, but that's always been my observation. And
Mm-hmm.
from one hand, maybe that's an opportunity to kind of discover the things that you need to deal with. But I've also found that it's really useful to have a tool to redirect your mind in that moment, because at 3 a.m. it's probably not the time that you need to be worrying about your
Yep.
retirement account or your big
Yep.
project.
Right. Absolutely. So, speaking of scientific research, and I'd love to. I know you've done some evidence-based retreats, and so I'd love to just hear a little bit about some of the scientific research that you've done around this, and as it pertains to the retreats, and yeah, just what some of your findings have been.
Yeah. So when I was a graduate student, I was running studies all the time and reading hundreds of scientific papers. And one of the things I noticed is that psychologists were trying to make claims about how much people could change and grow based on these scientific studies that would just manipulate one tiny part of their lives. Like it would just give them like 30 minutes of mindfulness training and then try to make some conclusion about how much somebody could improve their focus or their well-being. And there's a reason for that, which is that uh, the scientific method is largely about trying to manipulate just one thing at a time so that you can be really confident that any differences that you observe are a consequence of what you manipulated. So
Sure.
whether it's a psychotherapy or a drug or a supplement, you just tweak one little thing and then you see what the difference is. But it was clear to me that the limitation of that approach is that very few things in our lives are influenced by only one little factor, right? Everything is connected. And so if you were interested in understanding how much can somebody improve their happiness or how much can somebody improve their focus, you would need to take an approach that's a little bit more multifaceted than that. So starting when I was in graduate school and then continuing on for many years, we started running these studies that I sometimes describe as like boot camps of personal development,
Hmm.
where we would draw from the scientific literature and try to find a whole variety of different tools and strategies that we could introduce to people all at the same time over the course of just a matter of weeks to try to understand how much change is really possible for people if you create the ideal circumstances for those changes. And so it sort of, it went a little bit against the grain of how science is usually done, but I think it was sort of like a necessary departure if what you're interested is understanding how much is really possible for people. Uh,
Sure.
and so, yeah, we've run a lot of studies like that over the years, and it's probably been the most rewarding professional project that I've got to be a part of because I've got to participate and watch how much people can actually change in a short amount of time uh, if you support them in improving their vitality and their mindfulness and learning how to do all the things that are good for them and putting them in a community of like-minded people who are all trying to make the same kind of changes. Under those circumstances, people can change a lot more than I think they realize.
Mm. Yeah, that's, uh, you know, I think in general, science has shown on so many different levels, like, I instantly think of like epigenetics. It's like, oh, no, it's in your genes. That just is how it is. And it's, hold on, wait, all of this stuff is much more malleable than I think, you know, we were led to believe in the recent past.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because we got to measure so many different types of outcomes in these studies that would matter to people's lives. Things like life satisfaction and mood and self-esteem and self-efficacy and reading comprehension and fluid intelligence, like just tons of different stuff. But one of the things that we measured was gene expression,
Mm,
because the things that you do on a daily basis actually really influence which of your genes turn on or turn off. And so we were actually able to observe in one of our studies that the training program that we created for people led to measurable changes in which genes were actually active and creating proteins and influencing their physiology. So yeah, even our genetics, which seems like the thing that's maybe most hardwired about us, is actually changing on a daily if not hourly basis.
yeah. Wow. So you were able to observe like the genes turning on and off in some way. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So before and after they did this retreat with us, we took blood samples so we could actually look at which genes were active and which proteins that they were creating.
Wow.
And yeah, we were looking specifically at genes involved in our immune system.
Hmm.
And there are a couple of different categories of genes. Some of them are really about antiviral genes that kind of develop the parts of our cells that try to fight off viruses. And then there's also anti-inflammatory genes that are a part of our immune system, but kind of a more first line of defense that aren't
Yeah.
specific to any kind of virus, but they're just trying to, deal with the presence of pathogens or potential threats. And there had been some research to suggest that which types of genes are activated throughout your whole body depends on your psychology and the amount of stress that you're experiencing. And that's what we found too, that uh, as a consequence of going through this training, the activation of these kind of immune or inflammatory immune genes that are kind of involved in just dealing with threats in general uh, decreased a little bit relative to the antiviral genes that are sort of more like able to deal with any specific threats that might be coming on board. And uh, it's it's consistent with a general pattern that psychologists have found that when you're in kind of a safer, less stressed environment, inflammation tends to decrease a little bit, and you have more reserves to increase these antiviral genes. So it's a little bit in the weeds, but I think what's fascinating about it is that it suggests that so many aspects of our lives can all change if you create the right circumstances for it.
Yeah. 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 Well, it's really, what I love about it is you get, of course you have people who some of this stuff is like woo woo too. And I love being able to show, and I'm sure you do too, or you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. Hey, let's look at the science that supports this stuff. And it's really, you know, yeah, it's just really inspiring to see how, and like you said, the fact that, as opposed to what we've been kind of taught to believe, these genetics are hardwired. No, hold on. They can change hour by hour based off of, your state and where you're at, mentally. And that's just
Yeah,
incredible.
absolutely. And every time you work out, you're changing what genes are turning on and off. Every time you meditate, you're changing what genes are turning on and off. And there are some aspects of our genetics that are maybe sort of less easily influenced by our lifestyle, but there's
Right.
thousands of genes that are strongly influenced by how we live our lives. And
Yeah.
I think that that can be an empowering perspective for people.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, because that's something that probably a lot of people haven't thought about. Hold on. By meditating, I just flipped on a bunch of positive light switches, and
Mm.
within my physiology, not, that is beyond just like the consciousness aspect of it, right? And so I'm curious what you think about, I know, the science of happiness really is what led you down this path in your life. And one of the things that I have said on the show before many times, that I sort of subscribe to, is this idea that, yes, of course, happiness is super important in all of our lives, and sort of the focus and what we're all, the aim, the aim of our life, as much happiness as possible. However, I would say what's more realistic, even, from the ultimate perspective, I don't believe we're meant to always be happy. I believe a more realistic baseline than happiness, even as all the time. I think we can certainly do a lot of things to make it so that's most of the time we're in that state. But I can't remember where I originally heard it. It might even have been Eckhart Tolle, years and years ago. But they were talking about, we can't always be happy, but we can't always be at peace with what is.
Mm.
And that really resonates with me. It's like, yeah, you're
Mhm.
meant to have struggles and strifes and hardships in your life. That is, smooth seas never made for a skilled sailor, and we all came to be skilled sailors. And so, the perspective that I can choose, and that's really what a lot of this show is about, is like, hey, I am, whatever arises, love that. I'm going to find, peace with it. I may not like the fact that I am dealing with this very challenging thing. Doesn't bring the most joy and happiness into my reality, but I can trust the mystery, trust what's unfolding, and find peace with it. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. I guess my perspective is that for most people, it is realistic to significantly increase their happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think everybody has a really clear philosophy or sort of strategy for how to do that, but I think that is possible. But a big part of that is about being able to be at peace even with the challenges. Like
Yep.
exactly what you say. If I look back over the last 15 years of my life, like I'm I'm definitely happier now than I was 15 years ago. And part of that is that, I have more positive emotions relative to negative emotions than I used to. And so I think it's fair to say that, I'm happier as a consequence of all of the, work I've put in. But absolutely, I still face a lot of challenges in my life and I still experience difficult emotions on a regular basis. And maybe one of the biggest changes that has happened for me over the years is that when I'm experiencing anxiety or frustration, I'm not struggling over it to the same extent. That there
Yeah.
is this undercurrent of peace that's still
Hmm.
accessible even amidst the difficulties.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when I think about lasting happiness, it's not a state of like 24/7 excitement and joy. Maybe there's a lot of excitement and joy, but it's also this ability to be okay with things as they are, even when they're not so easy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find, that, when I get into the state of stress or anxiety or whatever, having trained myself to then observe, step into the observer role, like, oh, hold on, you're doing that thing. And that is like surrender to what's happening. Okay. This is, it serves me really well to be able to reflect and say, oh, hold on, why is this happening for me? Oh, okay. This is pushing my buttons. And that's how I get to where I want to go by, being a better sailor, right? I want to be a skilled sailor, and this is like, a bit of a challenge. This one kind of gets under my skin a little bit. So yeah, I found that really, I go less and less down the path of being lost in the negative emotion. It's like
Mhm.
it's you sort of train myself to like, oh, hold on, step back. And sometimes it's still it's and it's interesting because I think sometimes like energy is meant to move too. It's like I don't I think we have to be careful with not uh, you know um, correlating this with like repression of
Mhm.
emotion, emotion, energy and motion. So it's like everything we're talking about. It's like finding that balance. Like, oh, there'll be times where I probably will be agitated or upset, and the question is do I let that own me, or do I move that energy? Oh, I'm observing that I was, in a state that really isn't ideal for my physiology or my well-being, or I can actually choose my focus elsewhere, look for the silver lining, etc. And I think that really becomes the game.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really powerful perspective. I spend quite a lot of my time teaching mindfulness to people who haven't ever been exposed to it before. And so I've
Hmm.
had to think a lot about what are the ways of sharing these ideas that doesn't create misunderstanding or resistance. And, you know, mindfulness, a really key part of mindfulness from my perspective is acceptance and being able to just be willing to allow the difficult thoughts and emotions that we're experiencing to be there. Sometimes you can learn from them, but at the very least, you don't have to create a struggle over the struggle. But
Right.
uh, that's actually a difficult thing for many people to really understand the very first time they're learning about mindfulness before they've had a lot of exposure to these ideas. And the concept of acceptance can be a little bit of a tricky one because just what am I really supposed to accept?
Yeah.
And so oftentimes when we're introducing people to mindfulness, we also share strategies that are like very practical about how can you use your attention to change your thoughts and your evaluations so that you don't have to feel all the negative emotions that you're experiencing.
Mm.
And one of the strategies that we use is called refocusing, where you notice that you're just kind of ruminating on something in an unskillful way that's not getting you anywhere. And
Hmm.
sometimes what you need is just to interrupt that pattern and to
Hmm.
refocus your attention on something else. You don't have to sit there and like explore and accept the feelings, you need to break the pattern in your
Mm-hmm.
mind that's just creating a counterproductive feeling. Similarly, another strategy like that we teach is called reevaluation, or sometimes it's called reappraisal,
Mm-hmm.
where you're making a judgment or an evaluation about your life or yourself that's just causing suffering. It's not helping anything. And it's helpful to be able to notice that and then to use attention to say, you know what, I'm going to replace that evaluation with one that is also true, but more empowering, a different way
Mm-hmm.
of looking at things that can help make my life better instead of worse. And so both refocusing and reevaluating, I view those as strategies that we can use proactively to change the emotions that we feel. And I think sometimes that's appropriate. Yeah, it
Yeah.
could, if taken to the extreme, start to drift into that territory of repressing our feelings.
Yep.
But sometimes we're just stuck in a loop, and what we need is just to break out of it.
Yep.
But you have to, this is where, it takes some discernment. You have to also be able to notice, when am I experiencing something that I shouldn't just try to think my way out of? I really need to be present with this. I
Yeah.
need to let this actually exist in my experience for a while.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's where acceptance comes in, so that you can let it be there and recognize that you're still okay, even when you're feeling the sadness or the anxiety, or even when you're having those negative thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Very well said. It's like that discernment is so key, being able to discern the difference between, okay, and I see that a lot in the community, in the kind of transformational community, spiritual community, where it's like the people who are constantly, focused on their trauma and how to deal with trauma or process trauma or feel the trauma. Or I think there is absolutely a time and a place to like, not, especially for trauma, that just comes to mind is, a trauma victim. Like a lot of times it's, something happened as a child and then it's been repressed. And then you start on your path of self-realization and it's like, oh, this thing is looming. I need to look at it. I need to sit with it. I need to feel the emotions so that I can release them. And, that's people, I think some people get caught up in the, okay, let me just, relive it, not release it, not, move through it, and stew in it instead. So I think that's a very important point that you're making, is like discerning when it is appropriate to be with something, when is something that's just a loop that is not helpful at all, which we all can do. And I think, the way you put it is really good. Just the ability to refocus on, okay, well, hold on. Is there another way I could look at this that is a more empowering way to approach it and start, shifting my attention?
Yeah. I just this last year, I learned something new about sort of the time and place for really observing and working through our difficult feelings. It surprised me. I came across scientific research that actually showed that emotional suppression, which sounds like a terrible thing, that sounds like a bad strategy. You shouldn't suppress your emotions. But this research showed that among adolescents who were experiencing a pretty difficult time in their life, emotional suppression was actually associated with better outcomes.
Mm,
And that kind of stopped me for a moment. I had to sort of like reflect on that and think about
interesting.
why that was. But I think it has to do with, what you're saying about time and place,
Yep.
because, if you're, this is just sort of a random example, but if you're like at work and it's like a difficult day and you've got a whole lot of stuff on your plate, and you start having some emotions coming up, maybe about past trauma or just really difficult things in your life, that's probably not the time and the place for you to go really deep into those
Yep.
emotions and try to sort them out. But there's probably maybe a time later when you're at home and you've got some social support and you've got some time where it makes sense to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. Like even that as a child, like it's like, okay, by suppressing this, it gets me through to the point where I'm an adult, and then now I'm capable of this, coming up and processing it in a way that, makes sense. And then when you get to the really zoomed out perspective of, everything happening for us as opposed to us, it's like, okay, and that's part of that soul's journey, I believe, to have maybe carry that in some way or experience it so that then they can come out the other side and move through it. And then, a lot of times you see those sorts of situations where the person does process something as an adult and goes on to help many other people who went through the same thing. And they couldn't have really done that as effectively had they not experienced it themselves, and, on and on.
Absolutely.
So what, I guess with all your studies that you've done, what has there been anything that's been the most surprising? I mean, what you just said is something that I guess was probably kind of surprising, that suppression can lead to positive results in some cases. And so, is there anything else that comes to mind that, you didn't expect to find, but you did?
Yeah, I think this maybe circles back to some of that research we were doing to try to understand just how much somebody's life could change in a short amount of time. And in launching that line of research, my hypothesis was that people could change more than what science seemed to show. Most of the studies that I read as a graduate student, you'd be lucky if there were some moderate improvements in, one or two outcomes. And I felt like there had to be more than that. But in the studies we did, we had the opportunity to measure dozens of really valuable outcomes, and I was really surprised at how big the improvements could be across so many different parts of somebody's life at the same time. Because my thinking had been that, if you just take one or two parts of somebody's life, say like their stress and their self-esteem, and you make a big change in just those two outcomes, that alone could make a pretty big impact on somebody's happiness and their well-being. And so I figured that in our research, we would find that our, sort of like boot camp of personal development would affect several outcomes. But I was genuinely surprised at how big the effects were across so many different measures. And it caused me to have to sort of go back and think about what I really believed was possible for myself and for other people in terms of what kind of changes that they could make in their life.
Yeah.
I think part of this is that the kind of changes that we observed, they're not going to come from like downloading a new app or starting a new workout program, right? Like we put people like pretty deep into this, but I do now believe that for people who are willing to kind of put themselves in a new environment around new people, try on new ideas and really go for it, that most people can change more than they realize. And I think that's good to know, because, we all sort of get stuck in our sort of limitations and the things about ourselves that seem like they're never going to change, and they might be hard to change. But I've really come to believe that a lot is possible for us if we just put ourselves in the right environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine you're probably familiar with Dr. Joe Dispenza's work.
A little bit.
Yeah. He talks a lot about this stuff. I think you would, find him fascinating if you went deep on some of his work, because it's really looking at look how important it is, when we get into these habitual patterns, we sort of lock ourselves in energetically to what's possible. And by making shifts, that just opens up, new possibilities. And he goes really deep on that kind of stuff. And it's a really fascinating thing to think about, like, oh, hold on, maybe I pattern disrupt myself. What am I doing that is, the same? It's like, it's like the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And how little, when you think about it, like, how much a little shift can make a long-term change. If I'm going to shoot, a missile from LA where I'm at to New York, and it's on and then I move it 1 degree, all of a sudden it hits New England by the time it travels all the way across the country, right? And so I think that's that's, you think that 1 degree change, oh, that doesn't shift anything, but that compounds over time, right? And so I think that is a very inspiring thing for people to know. What you're saying is like, look, you can shift a lot more than you realize. And I guess that leads to my next question, which is, of all the things that you've seen and done, for that person who's just felt stuck for a long period of time listening to this, what would you say to them? Michael, what should I do to start that, positive spiral of happiness flooding into my life? I'm at the beginning. You said you deal with a lot of beginners, right? What is would meditation be, ground zero for you, or is there something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think maybe the way I would answer it is that part of what I've had to learn myself from all of this research that I've done is that it can be pretty hard to do it on your own. Like, I do believe that some of the most powerful, lasting changes that we can make to improve our lives are ultimately internal shifts. I really believe that. But I've also observed in myself and others that it can be very difficult to make those internal shifts if your environment stays exactly the same. And that for many people, to get traction with a new change, to not just like start something, but to actually get results from something, you need to change your environment. You have to change the ideas that you're exposed to, the people that you're around. And for people like me who tend to be sort of fairly independent and believe, oh no, I could do it on myself, that's not easy. It's easier to just go on Google, or it's easier to go to the App Store. It's easy to just try to find a way to do it yourself. But I really believe that if you feel a little bit stuck, then you should think about, what can I change about my environment and my community that will support me in making the changes I need to make, so I don't have to do it by myself.
That's a great piece of advice, I would say. And finding, I think it's meetup.com is one where, like, I went to a meetup in my hometown, just last night, that it's people who have a similar interest, and, and so, that's the great thing about utilizing Google or the internet. Like, oh, have you thought of that? Utilizing it to find people to really connect with who maybe are at a similar place, similar interest, similar place in their journey. And
yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Or even create your own, that's sort of like, I believe that's the kind of whole thing with meetup.com, is just using that as an example. It's like, oh, you have something you want to do, here it is. And you can set it up here, and others will find it if they search. And so,
yeah. And maybe for some people, you already have these people in your life. You just haven't created that sense of community with them around it. And so, I love the idea of going on Meetup and just like putting yourself into a new community. I think that's so powerful. As somebody like me who's a little bit shy, it's also a little bit intimidating to do. But I think as another starting point, maybe you have some friends who are facing similar challenges or who have some similar aspirations, and they might benefit too from having somebody that they could sort of talk about it regularly or meet about it regularly. And so that might be another way to change your community and your environment that could help facilitate some of these changes.
Yeah, that's exactly what Dr. Joe talks about. You must change your environment and change your patterns if you want, because in the energetic repercussions of that, it's like the 1%, and how, where that can lead, that butterfly effect, right? And it makes me think the meetup I went to is a crypto, based thing, right? People are interested in blockchain technology, et cetera, et cetera. And then the guy who puts it on, I get talking to him, and he's, interested in, he's kind of stepping into becoming a yoga teacher. And, we do a lot of like, mindfulness centric events at the co-living property that I run in town, which then led to me and him like, oh, well, maybe I'll give you a chance to come teach yoga at one of these things. Like, he's wanting to step into that. Well, that all came through something that could be viewed as very the other end of the spectrum, cryptocurrency and blockchain technology and, but because he put that he's the one that organized this on Meetup, and now it led to this other relationship that now is leading him to a whole new community of people to interact with that he hasn't really been exposed to, but he's longing to be exposed to. Or he was also telling me how, one of the things he likes to do is chant. And he happened to, hear his neighbor chanting the other day. And so he's like kind of mustered up the courage. If I like to say, if it scares you and it excites you, it's probably for you. And so, he mustered up the courage to go over and say, hey, I heard you chanting. I like to chant too. I'd love to chat with you about it. And next thing you know, they get together and now they're chanting together and, he's learning from this guy. And so it's that putting yourself out there a little bit, can go such a long way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And sometimes you push yourself a little bit outside of your comfort zone, and then you might really be surprised about what you discover and what happens.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to shift gears a little bit here and go to a bit of story time. The listeners love to hear stories of synchronicity or serendipity or a positive paranormal story or just something inspiring. And I got to think a man in your line of work has something up his sleeve. So any fun stories to share?
Yeah, Brandon, I thought you might ask me this. I was trying to think about what sort of synchronicity in my life would actually be interesting for your audience. I don't know if there was many, but I thought I would tell you about a moment that I shared with my dad that I haven't really talked very much about, but that made a big impact on me. And this was way back, I was 15 years old, well before I was such an upstanding citizen. And I was on a school field trip, and I made the really stupid decision to steal a shirt from a department store, and I got caught.
Oh, wow.
And, the fallout was very unpleasant, but my dad was on a business trip at the time. And so it was a few days before I sort of had to face him and talk to him about what happened. And my dad was a great guy. He was a big guy with a really deep voice, and he didn't get angry very often, but when he did, like, the whole room would shake.
Oh, wow.
And so when he got home, I was sitting in my room and he was coming up to talk to me. I was pretty nervous about how it was going to go and what he might say. But he sat down on my desk and he said, Mike, I'm a little bit worried about some of the decisions that you've been making, but I love you so much and I believe in you.
Wow.
And somehow I got the message that maybe you needed some new shirts. So I picked up a few for you at the airport on my way home. And he had a gift for me of shirts that he had just bought. And I was extremely touched by the gesture.
Wow.
It turned out that the shirts didn't fit and they weren't my style. I actually never wore them, but it didn't matter because they still meant so much to me.
Wow.
And, with time, as I've looked back on that experience, I've come to understand that I think my dad, he knew that he didn't have to scold me. He didn't even have to try to change me. What he needed to do was just show up and really see me with love and acceptance. And that if he did that, then just naturally, I was going to change in the ways that I needed to. And I think I did.
Wow.
And so maybe the little synchronicity or connection there is that, it's not lost on me that I've then gone on to spend a lot of my life teaching people about mindfulness. And, a key part about mindfulness is being able to show up to all the things that are happening inside of you with patience and acceptance, not needing to change them, knowing that they're going to change on their own. So that was a special moment in my life, and that's my story for today.
Yeah, that's definitely an inspiring story. It makes me think of, I believe it's Les Miserables, the story where the guy is gets caught stealing from the priest or something, and the police drag him back in, and we caught the scoundrel, and he's like, and he's like, oh, what? You forgot to take this one. And like, this is, kind of like let him off the hook. Like, oh no, I was giving him this stuff and you forgot these. And, and it just touched the thief so much, that it completely shifted his life. And what a powerful gesture. What a wise father to see through all of that. And it's so cliche and so true, but my favorite quote, love is the answer now. What was the question? And it's just, he brought that energy to it, and probably the most effective thing he could have done, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Very, very cool and inspiring story. Thank you for sharing. And I know the listeners have enjoyed this as much as I have. What is the best way for them to connect with you and, follow your work and participate in anything that you've got going on?
Yeah, so we are on Instagram and Facebook. Our account is Empirical Wisdom. And there we try to share content that is about helping people learn how to live a happier life by sharing strategies that kind of sit at the intersection between rigorous science and the world's wisdom traditions. So it'd be really great to connect with people there. And also what I'm most excited about right now is our Summer Institute in Applied Psychology. This is a retreat that we're leading this summer that's based on all of that research I described, over 10 years at UC Santa Barbara, to try to understand the best ways to really elicit meaningful and lasting changes in people's lives. And so it's a 3-week program held at a beautiful retreat center in Costa Rica. It's going to be a lot of fun, and it's also pretty affordable. So if people are interested in learning more about that, they can see all the details at empiricalwisdom.com.
Cool. And it's a 3-week retreat.
It's a 3-week retreat in Costa Rica. Yeah.
Wow. That's an intense amount of time, which is cool. Like how wonderful.
Yeah. It's inspired by some of that research we did where, if you really want to help somebody, we sometimes describe it as helping people reach escape velocity, where they sort of reach a speed where they break free from the gravitational force of all of their old habits and mindsets. And, that takes more than a weekend to do.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm so looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. It's like, what do they say? How many days it takes to break a habit or create a habit?
Yeah, I think they say about 3 weeks, actually.
Yep.
Coincidentally.
Exactly. Yep. Makes sense. Well, I do have one final question for you, and it is this. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Michael Mrazek?
Yeah, I definitely believe that we each have to define this for ourselves. And I think that the things that bring the most meaning to my life are the people that I love and that I care about, and also the big and small ways that I can try to make a positive impact on their lives.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, this has been definitely a positive impact on mine. I appreciate you so much for doing the work that you do and taking the time to come on and share some of that wisdom and insight. And I also appreciate all of you out there for tuning your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts into another episode. Until next time, journey well, everyone. Also, before we sign off, I wanted to remind you to download the Golden Key audio or ebook as my free gift to you at goldenkey.gift using the Golden Key code POSITIVEHEAD. And please, if you enjoy my gift, leave a positive review on Amazon so others can find the book and unlock their lives with the help of the Golden Key as well.